all in the theater? Do we see the dancing popcorns?
We are all in the theater, yes.
All right. So, welcome, welcome. Let's jump right into it. Or, well, let's see what comes after this anyway. Oh, looks like we've got, oh yeah, I've got the FBI warning and stuff like that. Actually, maybe we should take a look at this one. Okay, so this presentation is intended solely for educational purposes, or so I say. There's also some entertainment purposes. I hope you find it entertaining as well. But please take this information and use it only for good legal and ethical purposes. That is the purpose of our field, is to improve security, not to take away from it. Remember that everything that you learn here in this club, at this university, it's a tool and it can be used for good or for evil. And I'm only here to present information that's intended to be used for good. Also, I'm going to be making some movie references, a lot of movie references, or a lot of references to one particular movie in particular that I don't own the rights to. I'm not trying to infringe on their copyright. I believe that this is fair use. This whole presentation is not intended to reflect my employer. I'm not here on my employer's behalf. I'm here on my day off. I've actually got PTO this week. So this is purely my own perspective. Your mileage may vary. Terms and conditions apply. Please keep in mind that while I think I'm funny, you may not. Sorry in advance. All right. So now the main event: red teaming introduction to intrusion. So just one more thing before we get started. I'm sure there's a lot of new folks here at FAST that are wondering, who is this old guy who's going to be yammering on to us? Well, my name is Jordan Wheeler. I was formerly the president of FAST, as well as several other roles in my lead up to becoming president there at the organization. I also worked at IBM Cybersecurity Command Center in Boston, Massachusetts, as a cybersecurity researcher and an executive security advisor, giving presentations and teaching executives and technical people about the insights of cybersecurity from an offensive security perspective, as well as from an incident response perspective, primarily at the strategic level, but also getting down to the tactical and the technician level as well. These days, I work for a managed service provider in San Diego called Trident Group. I'm the principal information security consultant. We have a very small corner of our practice that's dedicated to offensive security, and me and a partner, another Cal Poly alumnus, Sami Marar, head up that practice and perform security assessments, penetration tests, and various other audits for our customers. I've been playing with computers and breaking things for a long time, and I wouldn't necessarily describe myself as extremely skilled or the best in the business. I'm more of a liability. So keep that in mind, that you're not hearing from the expert here. You're just hearing from another guy who's been doing it for a long time and has found a lot of ways not to do things, probably more than I've found good ways to do things. That being said, we're going to get into Introduction to Intrusion, Red Teaming 101. And the whole point of this is we're going to be exploring the heist. Successful red teaming or penetration testing is a lot like pulling off an elaborate heist. It's got multiple phases. It starts off long before the actual heist itself. And the primary difference, of course, between this and a movie style heist is going to be that penetration testing, red teaming, this is performed with permission and legal authorization. So we've got a contract, we've got a scope of work, we've got ethical and legal standards that we're following. But in order to pull off our heist and collect our loot, we're going to need a plan. So that's going to be the first step. So let's dive into, before we dive into these steps, let's just overline the phases of the process of penetration testing. And for this purpose, for the sake of this discussion, we're not going to make any distinction between red teaming and penetration testing. We're just going to lump them all together. And as you learn more about this field, you'll learn that in some circles or in some contexts, red teaming might have a more developed definition than just penetration testing, but we're going to kind of lump them all together for the time being. So phase one, planning the heist. This is the pre-engagement side of the assessment. Before we even initiate anything, before we start investigating anything, we're going to meet with the client and learn more about what we need to do. Then we're going to move into the reconnaissance phase. That's going to be casing the joint in the movie, right? We want to find out all the information about the target before we start touching the target. Then with our first touches, we're going to assess the environment, all of the attack surfaces and the potential vectors of ingress for weaknesses. identify what are the potential issues that we can take advantage of and how we can exploit them in order to do our deed. And we're going to exploit one of these vulnerabilities that we identify in order to exploit it and get access to our target. Once we've gained that initial access, then we need to, of course, pivot. We're going to need to get closer to our target. Post-exploitation, we might not actually be within close proximity to our target, and we want to pivot, and we may need to even escalate our privileges, gain further access into the environment before we can actually gain access to our target, our final target. And then, of course, that final target, that's the loot. We need to be able to collect it or document that we've been able to collect it and get it out. In some cases, in red teaming, there's actually going to be some exfiltration, but in a penetration test, typically we're just documenting that we had access to it. And then, of course, there's going to be lessons learned. We need to provide that both to the client as well as to our own team so that they can improve their systems and that we can improve our own. All right, so let's dive into that first stage here. We are planning the heist. So if you remember the movie Ocean's 11, Danny says something about the vault at the Bellagio, and he's sharing these blueprints with his partner Rusty. And Rusty says, if I'm reading this right, and I think that I am, this is probably the least accessible vault ever designed. And he points at one thing and says, you know what, actually, I'm wrong. It's definitely the least accessible vault ever designed. And so when we are intentionally trying to bypass security that's developed and intended to keep us out, we need to plan what our engagement is going to be. And for a penetration test, this actually has a lot of pre-engagement meetings with our client. Thankfully, we have the opportunity that since this is a legal and authorized assessment, we don't need to be surreptitious. We don't need to hide in the dark when we're getting ready for this assessment. We can actually contact our clients directly and get as much information about what their goals are and what the targets are as possible. So there's a few different methodologies that we can deliver in the process of this assessment. We might want to focus on certain areas of the network. We might want to focus on the external areas, the perimeter, the internet-facing side of the network. We might want to focus on a specific application or a specific service. Perhaps there's a new system that's been introduced into the workflow, and they want to test what the potential vulnerabilities are of that. But in many cases, for a penetration test, we're given a very wide scope, and we need to actually narrow that down in order to have a better focus on what the customer actually wants. So in some cases, we're given a more narrow scope, which is going to be just a specific application or a specific function of the application. It might be a particular area of the network. It might be a specific API, or it might be all of those. It might be very broad. It might be an entire network itself without any specific focus or priorities. And when we go very broad, what we're going to be getting is general coverage, but not a lot of depth. When we go very narrow and we specify only a specific app or a specific API, then we're going to be able to target that and spend a lot more time on that specific target and be able to get deeper into it and have more in-depth findings. So that's kind of the balance that we have to explain to our customers. And remember, customers generally don't understand the process and sometimes don't even understand the purpose of penetration testing. So we really have to be their ally and help them understand what it is that they're getting into, what it is that we can do for them, and help them understand whether they want to have a more narrow focus or a more broad focus. We don't know that. They don't necessarily know that off the top of their head, so we have to help them develop that understanding and what they want to be the focus. Now, there's two different main methodologies that are used in penetration testing. You can see them listed here as black box and white box. Black box means that we don't know anything about the targets. We're being given a list of IP addresses, or we're being given an IP subnet range, we're being given a few domain addresses, or an API endpoint, but we're not actually being given documentation as to how these systems work, what their configuration is, or what the priorities of their business operations are. Black box means we're given as little information as possible. And for the most part, this type of assessment is to simulate the attack from an external attacker who doesn't know anything about what they're getting into, but they're trying to exploit this organization. And that's contrasted with a white box assessment, which a white box assessment is going to be much more open. Documentation is provided. The specific configurations, or at least the identification and inventory of the services and the specific assets within the scope are going to be identified. And basically, with a white box assessment, the assessor can ask a lot more questions and get a lot more information. That's going to fuel a much more effective assessment in the time frame allowed. However, that's not necessarily what all customers want to simulate. Some customers want to simulate that black box approach, and they say, well, let's assume that you don't have any information, you're not inside already, you haven't gotten any documentation. What could that such an attacker do? And in either case, a black box or a white box assessment, we need to define the rules of engagement, the things that are allowed and the things that are not allowed. For example, denial of service attacks are typically not in scope for a penetration test. We're trying to find vulnerabilities that will gain more access, not vulnerabilities that are going to shut down their system and make it harder for them to do business. Another constraint might be a type of some of the assets in scope might be excluded. Maybe that's because they are legacy systems, they're relying on old technology, either old hardware or old software, and it's known that these are vulnerable, and they don't really want us to waste our time on these known vulnerabilities. They want us to explore other areas of the environment. Another reason that constraints or exclusions might be applied is due to risk of that asset being knocked over. For example, you might have a DNS server or an Active Directory server, DHCP server, something that's a core function of the network. If that is affected, negatively impacted by the assessment, then that could have operational impacts on the rest of the organization. So maybe that's another reason that they would exclude it. And then a last reason that you might want to note that an exclusion may be relevant is if that asset isn't actually owned or managed by the organization that you're testing. And so then they are not able to give permission. So it would be out of scope. That could be a third-party server that co-locates in their environment that they use some of the services of. Could be a SaaS application. Lots of different possibilities for that. But we need to identify before we get into the assessment what the priorities are, how we're going about it, what the targets are, what we're allowed and not allowed to do. All right, so like the scene in Ocean's 11, we've got to be very careful, very precise, yes, and well-funded. And of course, you've got to be nuts too. You're going to need a crew as nuts as you are. So who do you have in mind? Well, when I'm conducting an assessment, these are the guys. This is my Ocean's 11 that I've got in mind to conduct our heist. And you might be thinking of the technical specialists. We'll get into those in just a second here. But from a business perspective, consider that there's both personnel on our side as well as on their side that we need to coordinate with. So the person who's going to be leading that coordination is the project manager typically on our side of the house. Then it's the lead assessor. Often that's me in my experience. We'll have a supervising executive who's either the VCSO or the director of our division, who's going to be overseeing the project for all three of us. And then on the client side, of course, we need to have contacts for the primary contact and the technical contact, at least for any of the issues that arise either in the planning or in the execution or the follow-up to the assessment here. And of course, when we're getting into the technical side, right, the lead assessor is probably going to be one of these different specialists. And depending on the scope of the assessment, we may be having multiple different types of assessments gathered under one overall engagement. And so we might need to have multiple technicians, different specialities involved in the assessment. So I want you to take a look at this list and see if you're interested in offensive security testing, which one of these specialists might you fall under? Because it's very rare that you're going to have a unicorn mastermind that has experience with all of these. And in fact, when you try to be an all-rounder, what you find is that you end up being a mile wide, but an inch deep. And so it's better to specialize. And in my opinion, it's better to have a team of specialists than to rely on one-man army type situation or one-woman army type situation. In the film, they say you're going to need a Boski, a Jim Jim Brown, a Miss Daisy, two Jethros, and a Leon Spinks, not to mention the biggest Ella Fitzgerald ever. And so these are the different types of attacks, the different types of cons that they're going to be pulling in the pursuit of executing this heist. So every specialist plays a unique role. All right, so we've gotten past the pre-engagement stage. We've got our information about the target, whether it's a black box or a white box assessment. We've gathered our specialists and connected with the client. But now, bad news first. This place houses a security system that would rival most nuclear missile silos. So we need to case the joint. We need to learn more about the security, learn more about how their operations work. In InfoSec, we've got the SOC, the Security Operations Center. That's their eyes and ears of the organization. In the casino, in the film, casino security has an eye and ear on everything, and so the attackers want to have an eye and ear on them. If this was a malicious scenario, right, instead of an ethical legal penetration test, the attacker would be operating in this phase from a distance. Reconnaissance is at a distance. This is a no-touch mode. We're analyzing the target from a distance without letting them know that we're learning about them. And in our case, as a penetration tester, this would probably involve interacting or scanning with the target environments from an external perspective, so things that are online on the internet, and acting as normal web traffic. So just browsing the website, maybe logging in or creating a user, maybe scanning it with automated scanners that are going to be very common, touching things on the internet, not getting too much in depth, and hopefully not setting off too many red flags in the organization. Now, for an authorized penetration test, they know that we're scanning, so we can be a little bit, not aggressive, but we can be, we don't have to be so surreptitious. We don't need to hide the fact that we are going about these initial stages of our assessment. But again, a malicious attacker would be doing this in a no-touch mode. So again, reconnaissance is, to emphasize once more, is analyzing the target from a distance without touching the target. And in the film, the crew learned the entry and exit points of the casino, especially into and out of the operations area, the backstage areas of the casino. So we need to do the same when we're performing our assessment. And I'll talk about the tools and a couple techniques in a moment, but one of them I want to touch on first is called OSINT, O-S-I-N-T. And that is using third party services, third-party personnel to gain information about the target, again, so that we don't have to touch them themselves. So in the film, one of the examples of this is that one of the members of the crew is studying the habits of the security personnel at the casino. And he's just overhearing a conversation that's going on where he's talking about somebody that he's into, this dancer named Charmaine at the Crazy Horse 2, a gentleman's club on the strip there. And this actually leads to them being able to intercept this person and convince Charmaine to lift the security personnel's badge directly off of this person. And this was able to happen because the security person was off-site in an area that they felt secure. They didn't feel that they needed to follow the same security precautions that they would if they were on the clock on premise. But now they're at the club, they're relaxing, and Charmaine is bribed and able to actually extract that badge. And this is pretty similar in the real world in penetration testing, because in many cases we find that an organization, maybe one that we're testing, has already been breached in the past, and there may be credentials that have been leaked out on the internet. One of these cases may be a ransomware operator who has collected these credentials and other data from the victim, and now they're disclosing some of it as a proof of life, showing, look, we've got your loot, and we're going to leak it out. We're going to air your dirty laundry if you do not give us what we're asking for. So finding dumps and credential leaks before even trying to get to the target is a key part of the assessment. And in the film, it enables them to get a leg up. Before they've even tried to get into the casino, they've already gotten access controls, credentials. They've already learned about how to get in and out. And so this is kind of arming them and getting them ready for the initial stages. So I mentioned that we'll give you a couple examples of tools and techniques for casing the joint for reconnaissance. And one of the key tools here is search engines, good old Google. And these days, Bing is pretty good too. but not just using the typical search function. You got to learn about advanced search functions. These are called Google dorks. Dorking is like adding filters and specific search commands. So you can do things like say, I want to search for all PDF files on this domain that were published between this date and that date. Or I want to search for any website that has the name of this organization, but isn't on the .com, the official domain of the website. So we can include, filter, exclude, and search the internet for different key documentation and assets and learn more about what our target, learn more details about our target before we actually engage. Another area that we want to look into is domain registration. And because domain registration has to be public, these days there are some privacy features that some domain registration services provide, but for the most part, there's going to be some public registry, even if it's obfuscated, of who owns and operates a specific website. Those are called the Whois databases. And a couple of my favorite tools or services that I use to access Whois databases and other registration information and network information is Domain Tools, and another one is Security Trails. And there are other services that enable you to actually search for devices, I should say, on the internet. And those could be websites, web servers, those could be firewalls, those could be routers, those could be IoT devices, Internet of Things devices. Those could be functional, different, even factory devices that you may find on the internet. So using services like Shodan and Census, we can search using different search terms and the advanced search functions in order to identify potential network assets. These may provide just more information and context that we're going to use in our assessment, or they may actually fall within scope. And these tools can maybe even tell us if there are known vulnerabilities, because Shodan and Census will tell us what services and what ports are open and running on those systems. And then as an additional tool that we use, it could be public databases. And these are things that you could be looking at real estate records, state registration records, vehicle registration records, voting records, the white pages. There's lots of different data brokers and services online that are going to be collecting information about different websites and businesses around the world, and even people around the world. And either for free or for a fee, you can gain access to these databases and collect information without the target even knowing that you've got access to that info. All right, we're having fun so far. Well, we've got a lot of info, we're armed, we're ready to actually start probing for weaknesses. So in the film here, they actually attach a network intrusion device into the network operations center, and they're able to tap into the surveillance feed there. But what we're going to be doing in a penetration test is performing what's called vulnerability assessment. There's several different tools depending on what area of the stack you're going to be using or investigating. But vulnerability assessment is typically automated. You're using scripts or software in order to cover a large scope or an entire surface area. We're doing very surface level scanning at first, just to identify which IP addresses are active. And then we're going to identify further down the line, okay, of these active hosts, we've discovered them, what services are running on them. And if we can even grab things like a banner is going to be basically the advertisement. A service says, hey, I'm a web server and I offer these features. I'm an FTP server and I offer these features. I'm an SSL connection and you have to talk to me in this manner. And when we perform a vulnerability assessment, we're going to get pages and pages of findings. And some of them are going to be sorted because they'll already be known to contain existing vulnerabilities. These are vulnerabilities that are associated either with an outdated piece of software. Okay, the banner says that this particular web server is running an outdated version of Apache, and that one is known to have different vulnerabilities built into it that have later been fixed, but they haven't updated their server yet. Or maybe it's pinging off of a particular configuration and it says, oh, this SSL connection is allowed to be talked to in TLS 1.0 and 1.1. And TLS 1.0 and 1.1 are outdated also, and they contain their own vulnerabilities. But it's not that the system is outdated, it's that the configuration hasn't prevented the use of 1.0 and 1.1. Most connections might be using 1.2, which is what we're supposed to be using. But unless you forbid and restrict connections on 1.0 and 1.0, 1.0 and 1.1, that's a misconfiguration, and that can be identified in vulnerability scanning. So we're going to get a list of prioritized known vulnerabilities, and using this, we're getting a better model of what the environment is like. We're seeing inside of the system, even though we haven't gotten inside of the system. So we're going to be using several different tools. On the network side, we could be using systems like Nmap, OpenVAS, Nessus, and Qualys. On the website, we're probably using services like applications like Burp Suite, which is a proxy that sits in between your web browser or your application and the actual server. So you can manipulate or inspect the different traffic that's going on there. OWASP Zap is an open source version, a very similar software to Burp Suite. NetSparker and AppSpider are similar commercial tools that'll actually spider or work through the website and able to find all the different pages and different components of this different of the application itself. And then if you're performing a mobile app penetration test, there's another framework called MobSF, or the Mobile Security Framework. This is another toolkit that can be used for identifying these vulnerabilities. You'll find most of these tools or similar tools in Kali Linux. There's another one called Parrot OS. These are basically operating systems that are built with tools already, well, built in, that are including these tools. So they're kind of ready to go for a penetration tester. So I recommend that you learn about these tools. Many of them are free, even if they're commercial tools. They have a community version that you can download and test on your own network. Remember to only test systems that you have permission to assess. If they're not, there's free open source alternatives like OpenVAS is the free open source alternative to Nessus, as an example. For the most part, a lot of security tooling is becoming a little bit more closed and behind commercial doors, but there's always going to be open source and free alternatives for the community because they're so important. All right, so we've probed for weaknesses, we've run our scans, we've got an idea of how things look on the inside, even though we haven't gotten inside. Now we need to actually pop a shell, gain entry. How are we going to do that? This is what people think of as hacking, right? This whole process is hacking, but this is the part right here people think of when they think of hacking. This is creatively leveraging knowledge of how a system works in order to exploit it. So I know that the way this lock works, and because I know how it works, I know that there's a flaw that I can exploit that's going to allow me to bypass or break this lock. And then because that lock is broken or bypassed, then I can access or deliver a payload that's going to help me move forward. So in the film, we can see this image here of a courier delivering a briefcase, the contents of which are very valuable, it's said in the film. And so this is Saul on the left here. He's got his entourage. And on the right here is the casino boss. The casino boss has been led to believe that Saul, with his glasses there, is actually a arms dealer with lots of money and access to lots of things. And so the casino boss wants to treat him really well because there's going to be benefits of treating well a powerful and financially flourishing individual. And so in this case, we're using a couple of different methods here in order to get in. First of all, was credential forgery, bluffing, and giving a story about who Saul actually is. And then there's also input validation flaws because the security team investigated Saul and they didn't catch his bluff. They didn't identify that he was actually not who he said he was. And in this way, Saul is able to gain access both to the interior operations area of the casino, as well as to get close proximity to the casino boss, who holds more keys that the crew need to get in order to get into the target, get into the vault. So really what we're doing here is we're exploiting trust. We're building trust through deception, through creativity, and we're exploiting that trustiness in order to gain access to more secured areas. And this scene continues inside of the briefcase. It appears to be these 4 jewels, these very valuable assets. And it turns out, we find later in the film, sorry, spoiler alerts, if you haven't seen Ocean's 11, You really should have seen it by now. It's from 2001. And if you haven't, go watch the film after this because it's great. One of my favorites. But the supposed jewels are not actually jewelry or gemstones. They are a Trojan horse. And what I mean by a Trojan horse is like the old story, you hide something malicious inside of something that seems trustworthy. And so it evades inspection. And in this case, the gems are actually explosive that are used to open the vault from the inside later in the heist. All right, there's another example of a methodology for getting in. Remember, we said hacking is creatively creatively leveraging knowledge of how a system works in order to exploit it. Well, this is social engineering, which is the same, but for social systems. And remember, all organizations are social systems. They have social hierarchies and organizational systems. And in this case, Rusty impersonates an official from the Nevada Gaming Commission, showing a forged credential and correctly guessing the required response to a security question. The casino boss asks, "Do you know Hal Lindley over there? Did you ever work with him at all?" And Rusty hesitates, but he says, "Not since he died last year." Man, what a lucky guess. But we've got that in security too, right? We've got that multi-factor authentication, answer a security question, press a button on a device or insert a code. And so even though social engineering is effective, you still have to have more information in order for it to be effective. But in this case, Rusty is able to not only bluff his way into getting the trust of the casino boss, but then he leverages that to gain access to the interior. They're going to interrogate one of the card dealers who's supposedly been working there illegally. And because of this, he instigates a potential threat and it feigns a fight. And I don't know if you caught it there, but this multi-step attack here just enabled credential theft. And so Rusty was actually able to steal the badge. Let's do that one more time. Steal the badge from the casino boss. All right. So here he's got the badge. He's got the credential, and that's going to enable access to the vault or to the elevators later. All right, here's another example of initial access exploitation. This is an interesting one. So here we've got the Virgil brothers on the left, and they're impersonating casino personnel. And supposedly they need to deliver this case right here at the bottom, to one of the secured areas. And the guy you can see squinting here is going, "Oh, I forgot my pass." Oh, guy's calling him an idiot, and the guy who's guarding the door here just wants to keep from creating a scene and doesn't want to disrupt the other patrons. So he says, hey, don't forget the badge next time, but for now, where's this going? I'll take care of it for you. And so he takes on possession of the cart here, not knowing that inside of it is another Trojan horse. There's a member of the crew inside of this case here. And so he takes it on and has his own personnel bring it into the vault directly. And so this is pretty similar to server-side request forgery, in which if I can't make a request to the server that is trusted and will be actually performed, if I can get somebody to perform that request on my behalf, they will be trusted, and then I will get the results without actually having to do it myself. So now that we've gained access to our target, well, we've gained initial access, but initial access is rarely enough to actually get to the final target, right? There's going to be a few more barriers in the way to get into the vault, to get to our loot. So from one host, we need to gain more access to another host to gain a more privileged position in relation to the target. And in the film, they end up doing a denial of service attack. And I don't know if you remember, but the explosives expert says, blind, broke, or bedlam. How about all three? And so they knock out the lights for the entire Las Vegas Strip. And this denies service. This denies access to the security personnel who are monitoring and managing. This denies insight and access to the operations and everyone else. And it also knocks out both the security cameras as well as those lasers that were inside of the elevator there, so that they can descend the elevator shaft down into the vault itself. And of course, they've got the man on the inside who was brought into the vault there. But even though you've gained access, you probably need to be able to escalate your privilege. And so in this case, he's jumping from one side of the vault to another, avoiding the security sensors on the floor in order to get over to the vault door. And he's going to deliver the explosives there and bust open the wall so that but the rest of the crew can get in and steal the loot. And speaking of the loot, now that we've gotten into the vault, we need to actually collect. And well, first of all, we need to identify what the high value assets are. We don't want to focus on the low value assets and waste time. We want to focus on the high value assets. And as far as exfiltration, for a red team assessment, you might actually exfiltrate data, and you might need to do some smuggling. We'll talk about that on the next slide. But for a penetration test, typically we just want to demonstrate that we have access to the loot. So in that case, it's screenshots. And when we go into the reporting, we're going to redact any sensitive information that shouldn't be disclosed. We need to consider the risk of taking possession of sensitive data, right? This is client information. This is their customer information. This is very sensitive, could be financial data or information that shouldn't be published in a PDF. So we need to keep that in mind and operate both with business sense as well as good ethics when we're getting to our final loot here. And like I said, in some cases we do, for a red team engagement where we're acting more secretively and we're testing the security defenses, then we might involve smuggling data out. Then we're probably abusing trusted services. Maybe the organization uses OneDrive. If we can use OneDrive without them monitoring it, then that would be a good way to exfiltrate the data. But maybe they've got very good monitoring on OneDrive because they use it as their primary data storage. But they haven't blocked iCloud. And so I can load the files onto iCloud and I can load them into my own account outside of their organization, right? There's many different services and softwares that can be exploited in order to smuggle data out of. And in this case, in the film, they actually have supposedly the casino's own security personnel carrying out the documents, or not the documents, but in this case, the cash and all the loot. And of course, now that we've got all of the loot, we can kick back, we can enjoy the fountains, and well, now we've actually still got a little bit more work to do. And in this case, this is probably where the hardest part of my job comes in. And breaking in is not easy, but reporting, pulling together all of what I've done, what I've tried, what worked, what didn't, documenting it and explaining it to the customer. This is really what the customer is paying for. They're paying for a report at the end of the assessment that's going to tell them. And for the most part, this executive summary here is what most readers of the report are going to be paying attention to. That's that high-level overview of what we did and what the purpose was, what we found, the most important risks and why they're risky, and then what we're suggesting that they do about it. The whole report is going to be structured similar to this, depending on the organization. You'll have a reiteration of the scope and the constraints, the things that we work together on to prepare for in the pre-engagement stages. We're also going to describe what methodology, what we were allowed to do, what we weren't allowed to do. What we weren't allowed to do goes probably within the constraints there. And then the bulk of the report is going to be the findings, detailed information with as much supporting documents, as well as the actual screenshots, the text, the commands that we run, and what solutions they have for resolving them. And then, of course, there's probably some kind of appendix. This could be some of the OSINT that we found. This could be some of the usernames or different things that we enumerated that aren't necessarily findings, but are supplemental information that's going to be helpful for our client to be able to improve in the future. And I know we're at the end of our hour here. Let me just wrap this up here. Post-assessment, there's a couple more things that we need to do. We need to review the findings internally before we disclose them to the client. We need to identify opportunities typically for assisting in the remediation or security improvements or doing further testing. If they're going to improve the security themselves, we can offer security testing after the fact to validate that these fixes have been implemented. We also want to review the challenges in our operation itself. So where in the heist did we succeed and where in the heist were we hampered in our endeavor? What can we do in the future so that we're doing this for the same customer or for a future customer? What can we do better next time? And then, of course, we need to review the findings in a meeting with the customer, explain to them what we found, highlight the priorities, and offer that assistance so that we can not only help them improve, we can add to our bottom line as a business as well. And my friends, that's all I've got for you. Thank you very much. I know that this was a very full hour and very dense, and I moved through it very quickly. But I wanted to cover all the different phases of a penetration test, and I will never give up another opportunity to watch Ocean's 11. And I got to watch it like 3 times doing this presentation. So yeah, you get what you get. Enjoy.
Absolutely fantastic. All the Ocean's movies are great. Got a round of applause for you here, Jordan. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It was fun.